Welcome back to the studio and our watercolor floral gift cards. So they're doing 3 gift cards today, following on from the one I did at Christmas that was so popular. So thanks so much, guys. Okay, so it's time to light my favorite candle, my happiness candle, and sit down with you. I thought I would start with some sketching because I get asked quite a lot about my sketching. And look, I'm showing you, it's like it's a 35-minute video today, and I'm showing you from scratch, including kind of, I guess, just how much I play around with my sketches and things like that. It's not, I don't pre-prepare this for you most of the time, and I do it live with you. So this is showing my rubbing out, my thought process, my thinking it through. As always, my designs come from my imagination. So I'm not actually copying any photos or an image on my phone or anything in real life. This is purely 100% from my imagination. The entire idea branched actually from this set of cards that I had imagined in my mind. And the Christmas white card one just kind of came first because it was that time of the year and I needed to make Christmas cards to send to my loved ones as well. So I thought I'd share the process with you. Okay, so we're starting off with some watercolor card. So this in Australian terms is 300 GSM, so it's really quite thick. In US and Canadian terms, it's around 140 pound. So I'll try to kind of keep that equivalent and that comparison for you to keep that in mind, because I know I have lots of friends from America and Europe, etc. So I'm starting off with an A5 card. I do find that these pads are really fun to work in. They're quite inexpensive. I will tag all that below for you, as I always do. I love the weight, the thickness of it. This is a rough tooth, so it's not, you hear people talk about hot pressed, cold pressed. This is a rough tooth. So this means that it's really quite textured. I really love this card. So to me, I love working with that texture. You've seen my style before if you've been here for more than a minute. I have a very loose, relaxed style, so it works really well with anything that is quite textured, and it does tend to be my preferred option. Okay, so you can see me working through this idea. This is 3 cards. Each one has a combination of ink and watercolor, which is why I'm working on the watercolor card. Just wanted to make that a little bit easier for everybody. You can, of course, use a different cardstock. You've seen me do it before. You just need to be a little bit more patient with your watercolors and how that's going to come together. Okay, so this card is showing a sweet young lass standing in a field. So she'll be gazing into the distance with an armful of lavender or lilacs or whatever you would like to call these blooms. Again, they are purely 100% from my imagination. They're not something I'm copying. So you can, of course, make them special to you. So if you do have a favourite flower or something that you like to sketch, by all means, make it your own. So she's standing in a field of wildflowers, so the blooms and grasses and things like that. So I'm trying to capture that very gently. For me, this is one of my favourite things to sketch. So for me, it's very quick and easy and very loose, which is definitely my style. And again, I will actually put an outline of where the blooms, just like I did in the first one, just so for spatial awareness I know where they're going to go. They will be erased at the end, but there's no use kind of getting to the point where you've created all those beautiful watercolors, which we're going to do next, and actually inked your work as well, and then realize nothing's going to fit. So that would be a rather large oops. And probably make you cry that you've wasted all this beautiful watercolor paper and time. So I do recommend that you do something similar. Again, very loose, as you can see, swirls and curls. It's indicative of what's going to be sitting there. And it gives me an idea when I'm doing placement as well. So don't worry, we're going to do all that together. So I did actually decide to combine this card tutorial with my cover page for my January Bujo, which is why you can see in this image it's not folded. Of course, you could absolutely do this just like I've done the young lass in the field with it folded and just using it, doing it on one side. Again, they're an A5 watercolor sheet, so from a pad of paper, and I've just torn those out early so that I didn't damage them or accidentally tear them later. I do talk about that on previous videos, so just kind of keep that in mind. If you're working in a pad, that can be difficult to remove the sheets, best to do it early. Okay, so this one will be my cover page, and it carries on with the theme for my January. I will link that for you below in case you're interested in doing some journaling with me as well. Okay, so for me this is probably a little bit something that would be close to my heart. A sweet summer dress with an anglaise trim, all those little embroidery pieces that I've, the little details that I've added there, little timber bracelets on her wrist, and she will be carrying a big bouquet of blooms in her arms, so I didn't actually have to worry too much about the facial features, which was a blessing. So here you can see now I'm quite happy with my sketches, and I'm inking these in. You can see from the pigment liner in my hands there, these are my favourite Staedtler pigment liners, and I'm using the 0.02 for all of these cards so that I can capture the detail. There is quite a lot of detail, and because I'm combining that with quite delicate blooms, I really like the fine tip on this pen. It is one of the ones I use most in virtually everything I create, the 0.02 or the 0.03. Again, I'll link that for you below. Okay, so now I'm moving on to actually watercolor some detail on this. Because I create this live with you just from a thought or an idea I've had in my head, I actually started watercoloring this one, and I realized and when sketching it, and I realized I'd run out of my watercolor paper. So if you're wondering why the paint isn't moving quite the same, this card is actually on my favorite cardstock, which is not a watercolor, but it works perfect for this. Okay, I also was thinking that the entire base and the design would be inked, but then when I started creating it, I was thinking, you know what, a splash of color would look really cute in the blooms. So this was just a thought that came to me, and I just acted on it. I am using a combination, so if you're thinking the colors, I'm using a combination of the Cobalt blue, the quinacridone rose, and I'm just using a little bit too of my yellow ochre just to kind of just to soften the pinks in some cases. Very, very gentle amount. So again, use the colors that you feel speak to you, and using the colors in quite a pure amount as well, straight from the pan in a lot of cases, because when they dry, as you can see they have, they do get lighter. Now, I'm not too concerned in this case because I'm inking over the top to add in some details and leaves and things like that. So for me, when I first painted it and put it aside, I was, oh, goodness, I'm not sure if I'm happy I did that now, and I was regretting it. But as I always do, and as I always say to you guys, you know, don't throw something out, give it a minute, look at it with some fresh eyes, give it a second chance. And funnily enough, and I'd love to hear your vote in comments, but this one ended up being my favorite, I think. So the idea when I first started it with adding the color and then not sure about it, I ended up loving that I did, and I go back at the end and add a bit of extra watercolor. So if you're here for the watercolor more than the sketching and more than the card making, do watch to the end, because I do add some additional watercolor on the cards when they're almost done. And I just feel that it pulls them all together and just adds an extra splash, which was fun. Grasses and wildflowers are one of my favourite things to sketch. They actually feature quite heavily in a recent textile collection I released called We Are Australian. I will link that for you below in case you're interested in having a peek. You can actually just pop over to my website if you're interested and actually view that collection in full. In fact, the textile that you can see below is actually called Wildflowers, and the colorway is called Red Earth. And those blooms were watercolored by me before I scanned them and turned them into a textile. That one's actually available in 3 different colorways too, which is lovely, and they're available as ready-made linens or as a cut fabric as well. So if you are a sewer or somebody who would like to create something with your own textiles and your own style, I would love to hear what you think. And last but not least is my sweet little mason jar that is going to hold those adorable white daisies or chamomile. I have added a few extra stems in there just to add a bit of fullness to the jar, and I do go back at the end and add some colour to the water on this one, which was inspired really by the lavender and how well the colour turned out with the blend of ink and watercolour together. Now that all our sketching is done and our inking is done, we are moving on to the watercolour. Now you may wonder why there's an entire sheet of beautiful flowers there that you didn't see. Well, the honest truth is that this is when my camera decided to not behave itself. I did not realize, I thought that I did all of those with the filming on. I do film everything myself, create it myself. I don't have an extra hand or an extra partner to do that for me. It's just me doing everything on my channel and in my studio. So when you support me, it really does make this girl do a happy dance. Anyway, it wasn't until the next day that I realized, when I was checking all the videos and moving them over to my computer, that I realized that for some reason the video stopped recording and it missed all of these beautiful blooms. So I actually went back. I did do the extra ones that you're seeing me do. So you're actually watching me do the little daisy or the chamomile present. I did actually feel like I needed to do a couple of extra when I started looking at how they were going to go on the card. So I did backtrack slightly. But if you keep watching on, I actually do a couple of extra roses. I do another daisy. I do a little bit more of this lavender or lilac, whatever you want to call it, as well. So don't worry, there's actually a huge chunk of watercolor to come. And you can see that a lot of my colors have already pre-mixed, and that's because the silly video crashed, or the camera or whatever it is that decided it didn't want to work. I don't know what it was. But there you go, there's a blooper for you. It doesn't always go to plan, but lots and lots of fun to come. Okay, so white flowers for me were like, oh my gosh, when I first started doing them, and it felt so hard. But I actually really love painting them now. So this is something that you think, oh my goodness, because you have to have a really light hand with the color in order to give the impression that it's white. And obviously you can't paint white onto white card, nor do we actually use the China white very much in watercolor. In most cases you just water down your color to have a softer strength or value. You don't actually add white to it. You will see me add white. Having said that, you will see me add white when I'm doing the rose, because I want to make it more of an apricot. So I did add white in that. So there you go. It doesn't get completely wasted. But I have to say I very rarely use the white. So this is really using, as you can see, I've got the Payne's grey in that top puddle. And I've just got it really, really watered down. I'm making those petal marks and just kind of where they're going to sit very roughly, very loosely. And then I'm just dipping into a little bit of the Payne's Grey, a little bit of the Sepia, a little bit of the yellow ochre, and then just adding it a little bit here and there, and then allowing it to sit and dry a little bit before I go back and add a little bit more strength or a little bit more, you know, shadow or darkness. So I will go back to those. Okay, then I move on to my rose. Again, these are not pre-sketched. This is purely just kind of from my mind thinking, how would a rose look? You know, we've all seen roses and peonies in the store. So this was totally just me thinking, does it have a nice little dark center? Does it have kind of these kind of yellowy, apricot-y leaves in there as well? I thought that colors would be nice together. So again, this is the yellow ochre, this is the quinacridone rose, and a little bit of china white. That's the only colours I'm using on this. So, and then just in varying strengths. And then I'm going back in, letting it dry a little bit, because the beauty of using really good quality watercolor paper is that it takes a little while to dry, lets that water sit there. The blooms and bleeds are really what you're after in order to get, you know, that really gorgeous loose, that blowing in the wind, carefree kind of appeal that is, you know, it speaks to my heart. Okay, so I am coming back in now with a little bit of sepia and just straight from the pan, so it's quite strong. Just adding in a little bit of shadow to the stamen on the daisy or the chamomile, whatever you want to call those sweet little blooms. And then coming back again once my rose bloom has started to dry, and then adding in a bit of strength here and there in the rose as well. Again, I really encourage you to feel your way. Make it as loose or as authentic as you like. Whatever's going to suit you. These are going to be your gift cards to give to someone lovely, or even if you want to frame it and hang it on the wall. Okay, so as promised, here we are the following day. You can see my palette's nice and clean, and I'm working almost exclusively directly from the pans. I have at this stage already cut out all of the blooms, and as always, I'm just loath to throw out things that I find are useful and that could still be used and something that I'll be needing. So thankfully, I didn't throw out all of the offcuts that were quite large from my watercolor paper because, as I said, I was running out and want to keep those blooms uniform. So I actually picked up a few of those, and you can see they're odd shapes, but I picked up a few of the offcuts, and I'm coming in and wanted to show you a little bit extra of how to do the white flowers, these sweet little daisies or chamomile. And then just play with how I'm going to blend those out, how the colour and the shadows are going to work. You can see that I've done some of those lilacs or lavenders, but that was directly onto some cardstock I had. It wasn't in the watercolour paper. And with those particular blooms, I wasn't really happy with how the colours were actually blending and blooming. So I actually went and found all these offcuts and decided I will do a little bit of both. So it does show you, because I'm going to do another one of those little lavenders for you, it does show you how they sit in relation to one another. So if you are thinking that sometimes it's handy for you to be able to use some of the cardstock you love and just think outside the square, because we don't always have all of the tools at our disposal. And as I said before, it's better that you create when the mood strikes you than to not create just because you don't have a paper or something at hand. If you are interested, the paintbrush, or if you haven't seen any previous tutorials where I talk about this, my paintbrush too is an inexpensive one I picked up when we were holidaying in Barcelona at a lovely little market stall. It's a size 10, so it's actually quite large in comparison to a lot that you will see other YouTubers and artists using. But for me, I just love that little fine tip. And if you've been here for even a second or just been watching these, you'll notice that that's my particular style. I use that sweet little tip very expressively and loosely. So for me, it picks up the color and holds it really nicely in the belly, which does allow me to be quite liberal if I'm doing a leaf or just wanting to add a nice background color before I add in a little more detail. You can see me mixing up some colors for some leaves here. I love the sap green mixed with a little bit of sepia. It just muddies up the green and just makes it the perfect sage or moss green for me. And I have had a few people mention that they really liked that blend. So if you are thinking, what am I using there? That's what it is. Okay, so you can see me make sure that I do actually touch that wet petal because I want that green to kind of blend in to the rose, because that is how, well, for me, what I see, that green tends to join with the petals and just become one with the flower. So if you don't want your greens to not blend at all with your roses, make sure they do not touch the other paint while it's wet, or it will bloom and bleed into those other colors and it will change that finish. It won't have such a sharp edge. Okay, I'm working quite quickly because I want to make sure that I'm working wet on wet, but I do go back, and you see me do that a lot, especially with the stamens on the daisies. You'll see me wait until they've dried and then go back in wet on dry to add more definition and oomph, because your colors do lighten as they dry. So if you want something that has just more strength, a little bit moodier, if it's feeling all a bit too washed out and just too soft, just wait for everything to dry a bit and then go back in with a second layer and just be a little bit more heavy-handed. Don't be afraid to add some color in there. You can always lift it. So I do actually show you how to lift color quite a lot in the color palette I did on my January Bujo. So if it's something you're interested in, just head over and have a look at my January 2023 Bujo, and I do a whole color palette for that month. And I actually create the color palette and then I go back in the next day and just feel like it needs a little bit just less detail, so I go back in and lift some of the color and blend it back through. So it's totally something you can do. Okay, so while that rose bloom dries a little bit, I decided I'll do a bud as well, because you've missed that because of my silly camera. So I'm doing a little bit of a rose bloom here, something with the petals a little bit tighter, and then I'm going to add leaves on both of those. I love doing rose leaves because they always seem to be just quite a unique shape, and they're not so perfect. They're out in the elements. Sometimes they're a little bit curled, or they've got some burned from the sun or the wind, especially if you're in a Queensland or an Australian climate. We get such a hot summer. So if it's been raining, they don't like the hot sun on those wet petals. So you can see me here with that combination of the sap green and the sepia, popping the stem and the curling leaves on the rosebud. Again, using that nice fine tip and then just putting a little bit of extra pressure on as I've come down to the bottom of that stem. Obviously, everything is having a longer stem for a reason, and you're going to see exactly why in just a moment. So there are those sweet little leaves as I promised. Always like to leave a little bit of white space too, like it would be a reflection or a little hole in the leaf. It's important to have that negative space, and it's not necessary to come back in with white if you just remember to not be too heavy-handed on your page and allow some of that lovely crisp white background to come through. And last but not least, I'm coming back in with the watercolour paper and doing one of those sweet little lilacs or lavenders with a whole lot of the cobalt blue, and you can see me dipping straight out of the pan at full strength. And then I actually did the stem, I used the Payne's grey. It was actually really sweet because I'd gone over it with the cobalt blue first, so it was almost like a midnight blue. It was just so pretty. I really liked it. So these little blooms have a really slim, fine stem, and then just this beautiful, fluffy blooms on the top that are just really so much fun to paint. Just keep in mind that it's a canopy of blooms, and it's not the same as doing, you know, a rose or a daisy where it's very distinct petals. So this would be lovely too if you're doing something like a jacaranda tree or something like that. And then going in with that beautiful delicate tip. Don't get too concerned when you've added in your stems if you're feeling it's too harsh. When you're adding in your colour and it's letting it bloom and bleed, you're going to find everything will soften out nicely. I'm really happy with how this one came out. And you can see really quite the contrast between using the standard cardstock or using the watercolour paper. Okay, now that we've finished watercolouring all our sweet little blooms, and all the extra additions as well, keeping in mind that they need to face in all different directions to give you flexibility, so keep in mind your end game when you're creating. We're just picking up a pair of sharp craft scissors and we're going to go in and trim them all out with a small border before we put these beautiful cards together. Okay, so let's start with our mason jar, and you can see me just starting to think about, you know, which one's facing left, which are facing right, which are kind of reaching to the sky, and how are they going to sit together, how are they going to group in a pretty way. And as you can see, just 3 little daisies will be perfect in this little mason jar. Okay, so I've picked up a sharp craft blade and just a cutting mat, a small cutting mat, and I've cut the top and the bottom of the mason jar, as you see, which was quite simple. I did need to go over it a couple of times, so just to let you know, it does need, especially such a thick card, it needs a little bit of extra help. And then I've just used that little knife, as you can see, just to lift that tab slightly to help me ease those stems through and into place. This is just a little bit fiddly, but it's fun. So there you can see, just thinking how they're going to go together nicely before I get some double-sided tape and secure those in place. Okay, so you could do them in place, but I think that you'd damage your stems, so it was easier to pull them out, remove the tape before I slid them back in carefully. Keep in mind that that tape is like super strong. You can see me press this one down just a tiny bit and then think, oop, nope, needs to be a bit lower. Because I hadn't given it a really good press down, I could still lift it up, but otherwise you may find you tear your card. Okay, then I'm moving on to my sweet young girl with her hands full of blooms. And I'm going to trim, this one was a little bit more tricky, so kind of keep this in mind when you're creating the hands, how much detail you need. But I need to trim or cut a little slot in at the top of the hands and the bottom of the hands. So this is a little bit more fiddly. I did go over this a couple of times and then kind of use the tip of the blade just to make sure that they lifted up nicely. Make sure that your stems are quite fine to fit through that gap and ease them through gently so it looks like she's holding those blooms. And then obviously position them so that they're sitting nicely over her shoulders, otherwise you'll need to add additional detail there. And then just play around with the stems to see what works for you before you secure those in place. Okay, and last but not least, moved on to my lavender field, and I'm Wasn't sure if I was going to do the same thing and cut a slot and add them, but I decided in the end to layer them and then just trim the stem underneath. Okay, once that was in place, I thought, you know what, a border would look really sweet here. So I decided to give them all a little bit of a name. This one is Bloom Where You're Planted. So again, this was my cover page for my January Bujo. So this will be in my journal, reminding me to make the best of every situation. There's always joy to be found if we look hard enough. Okay, so I'm just adding this sweet little border again with my 0.02 pigment liner. This clear little ruler is just heaven sent because it means I can see everything through it. Always my favorite ruler. I'll see if I can find one and link it for you below. And then, as I promised, I've decided to add a little bit of extra color in. I loved how the lavender field turned out, so I decided to add some of that quinacridone rose just to her little bracelets. I just think it was the extra little pop it needed. Okay, then with my mason jar, this would have been much easier to do before I added the blooms, just an FYI. But again, I did this with you live and it was a thought I had, and I don't mind having a little bit of a fiddle. So I decided I wanted to add a little bit of colour, a little bit of watercolour to denote where the water would be in the jar. I just felt that it would warm up that piece. Again, the lavender field ended up being my favourite, so and I'm very partial to a mason jar. So I thought I'll just add in a little bit of watercolour and mix this one up with a mixture of the Payne's Grey, lots of water, and just a tiny touch of the Cobalt Blue I already had out. So it just really has that kind of ordinal or that duck egg that I just love that colour, and it works so nicely with the petals on the little daisies. Okay, and where would I be if I didn't add a little border to this one as well? So I'll be doing that in just a moment. And this one I decided to call Thanks a Bunch. And while I have you here, and before we go, I would like to say thanks a bunch. This one's for you. I really do appreciate having you here. Your support just means the world. I really do hope you enjoy doing my card tutorial with me today, and I hope that I inspire you to create some cards for your loved ones and say a thank you to someone you love, to mum, to your love, to a friend, to anyone at all. Finishing today with our Lavender Fields card, and I'm not sure which one's my favourite. It changes daily, I think, now, but I really did love how the little lavender that I first thought was a mistake ended up being inspiring me to add the colour to all of them. So I really do encourage you to be kind to yourself. So if you're not immediately loving something you create, to give it a second chance. And I'm going to show you all three of those cards together before we go, but I do want to say thanks so much again for being here. I hope you enjoyed the extra tutorial, the extra talky. I have been requested to be a little more chatty, a little less music, and let you know what I'm doing, so I hope that helps. Just needed to be patient on this one because there's lots of little fiddly elements, but I think it's totally worth it in the end. So great to have you here, and I look forward to having you back soon. Bye.